The scorching Texas sun beat down on the dusty streets of Fort Worth like a blacksmith's hammer. But it wasn't the heat that made Hattie Juárez feel like she was suffocating. It was the stares sharp as cactus thorns and twice as painful that followed her every move as she made her way through the crowded marketplace. The whispers weren't even bothering to be whispers anymore. There she goes. The Mexican girl. Don't know why they let her kind shop here with decent folk. Hattie tightened her grip on her woven basket and kept her eyes focused ahead, pretending not to hear. Fort Worth, Texas in 1875 was booming with cattle drives and railroad expansion, but tolerance for someone with olive skin and a Spanish surname wasn't exactly in abundant supply. Bet she's carrying a knife in that basket, an older woman murmured to her companion as Hattie passed. 22 years on this earth, and 18 of them spent in Texas. Yet she was still treated like she'd just crossed the Rio Grande yesterday. Never mind that her father had been a respected doctor in Monterey, before moving north a doctor who had saved countless lives before tuberculosis claimed his own 3 winters ago. Hattie stopped at the general store, pausing to straighten her simple blue cotton dress before entering. The bell above the door announced her arrival, and Mr. Peterson's smile faded the moment he saw who had entered. "What do you want?" he asked, not bothering with the pleasantries he offered other customers. "I need flour and sugar, please," Hattie said, her English perfect despite what people assumed. "And thread if you have any in blue." Peterson grunted and moved with deliberate slowness. Hattie placed exact coins on the counter, knowing he wouldn't want to touch her hand while making change. "Price went up," he said, pushing the smaller bags of goods toward her. "But the sign outside says price went up." His eyes narrowed. For some people, fighting back tears of frustration, Hattie reached into her small coin purse and counted out the additional money. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her cry. Her mother had taught her better than that before she, too, had passed last year, leaving Hattie alone in the small house on the edge of town. The door swung open behind her, bringing with it a gust of hot air and the distinctive jingle of spurs. The atmosphere in the store instantly changed. "Afternoon, Mr. Peterson," came a deep voice. "Fine day, isn't it?" "Indeed it is, Mr. Armstrong. What can I get for you today?" Peterson's voice had transformed into something almost musical with delight. Hattie didn't turn around. She just wanted to collect her purchases and leave, but Peterson had deliberately moved to serve the newcomer, leaving her items on the counter. "Just need some tobacco," and the man stopped mid-sentence. "Madam, I believe you were here first." Hattie glanced up in surprise, finding herself staring into the clearest blue eyes she'd ever seen. They belonged to a man perhaps 5 years her senior, with sun-bronzed skin and dark blonde hair that curled slightly beneath the brim of his Stetson. A thin scar ran along his jawline, and trail dust coated his denim pants and leather vest. A cowboy, and from the quality of his gear, one who wasn't hurting for money. "It's fine," Hattie murmured, reaching for her goods. "I'm finished." "Doesn't look finished to me," the cowboy said, his eyes flicking to the items still on the counter. "Peterson, you planning on wrapping the lady's purchases properly?" Peterson's face reddened. "Now see here, Mason, Mr. Armstrong," the cowboy corrected, his voice remaining pleasant though his eyes hardened slightly. "Mr. Armstrong," Peterson amended. "You don't understand." "This girl, woman," Mason corrected again. "And I understand just fine. Wrap her purchases properly like you would for anyone else paying good money in your establishment." Peterson's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water before he grudgingly wrapped Hattie's purchases in brown paper and tied them with twine. He shoved the parcels across the counter without another word. "Thank you," Hattie said quietly, not sure if she was thanking Peterson or the cowboy. She turned to leave, feeling the weight of eyes on her back. "Madam," the cowboy's voice stopped her at the door. "Might I trouble you for your name?" Hattie hesitated. No one in this town ever asked for her name. They simply assigned her whatever labels suited their prejudices. "Hattie," she finally said. "Hattie Juárez." Something flickered in the cowboy's blue eyes, not the usual distaste, but something she couldn't identify. "Mason Armstrong," he replied with a slight tip of his hat. "Pleasure to make your acquaintance, Miss Juárez." Hattie nodded and hurried out, convinced it was some kind of cruel joke. Cowboys weren't known for their progressive thinking, and this one would likely be laughing about the Mexican girl with his friends by sundown. The sun was even more relentless now, and Hattie quickened her pace. She still needed to visit the seamstress, who at least tolerated her presence since Hattie's fine embroidery work brought in business. Then she could retreat to the solitude of her small home, where the judgmental stares couldn't reach her. She was halfway to the seamstress when she heard the sound of hoofbeats behind her. Instinctively, she moved further to the side of the road, keeping her head down. "Miss Juárez." Hattie turned, surprised to see Mason Armstrong guiding his chestnut horse alongside her at a walk. "Mr. Armstrong," she nodded cautiously. "Let me give you a ride to wherever you're headed. This sun's fierce enough to boil a rattlesnake." Hattie blinked in confusion. "Why would you do that?" Mason's brow furrowed. "Because it's hot and you're carrying packages and it's the decent thing to do. You know who I am." She gestured vaguely to herself, her dark hair, her complexion. "What I am." His expression shifted from confusion to something like comprehension, then to a flash of anger that made her take a step back. "I know you're a lady walking alone in 90-degree heat," he said firmly. "That's all that matters to me." Before Hattie could respond, a voice called out from across the street. "Hey, Armstrong, you picking up strays now?" 3 men lounged in front of the saloon, the one who had called out laughing crudely at his own joke. Mason's jaw tightened, but he didn't acknowledge the men. Instead, he extended his hand down to Hattie. "Where are you headed, Miss Juárez?" Hattie hesitated, every instinct warning her against accepting help from a stranger, especially one who would surely face ridicule for associating with her. And yet, something in his steady gaze made her want to trust him. The seamstress, Mrs. Holloway's shop. "But truly, it isn't necessary. I'm headed that direction myself," he said. Though they both knew it was a lie, with a deep breath, Hattie took his outstretched hand. He lifted her effortlessly onto the horse, settling her sideways in front of him. The proximity made her cheeks flush, but he maintained a respectful distance as much as the saddle would allow. "Armstrong, you'll regret mixing with her kind," the man from the saloon called out. Mason clicked his tongue and the horse moved forward at an easy walk. "I apologize for that," he said quietly. "You're the one who will have to face the consequences," Hattie replied. "I'm used to it. You shouldn't have to be." There was a firmness in his tone that surprised her. "Why are you doing this?" she asked as they moved down the street, aware of the stares following them. "You don't know me." Mason was quiet for a moment before answering. "I've seen enough of the world to know that where a person comes from doesn't matter here, or at least it shouldn't." Hattie turned slightly to look at him, trying to determine if he was sincere. His eyes met hers steadily, and for the first time in years, she felt seen as a person rather than as a problem. "Thank you," she said softly. The ride to the seamstress was short, but by the time they arrived, Hattie knew that something had shifted in her world, though she was far from certain whether it was for better or worse. What she didn't know was that Mason Armstrong had his own secrets, and that their paths had crossed for reasons neither of them could yet imagine. The following morning dawned clear and hot, typical for late June in Fort Worth. Hattie rose early, as was her habit. to tend to her small garden before the worst of the heat descended. The modest plot behind her house provided most of her vegetables, supplementing the meager income she earned from her embroidery and occasional translation work. Her mind kept returning to the strange encounter with Mason Armstrong the previous day. After depositing her at the seamstress, he had tipped his hat politely and ridden away, leaving her to wonder if she'd imagined the whole incident. Mrs. Holloway had been scandalized, of course. Riding through town with Mason Armstrong. "Girl, do you have any idea who that man is?" Hattie had shaken her head, suddenly worried. "One of the most successful cattle drivers in the territory," Mrs. Holloway had informed her, eyes wide. "They say he started with nothing but built his own operation from the ground up. Drove 10,000 head to Kansas last season and came back with enough money to buy half the county if he wanted." This information had made Hattie even more confused about why such a man would bother with her at all. Now, as she pulled weeds from around her tomato plants, she tried to put the encounter out of her mind. Whatever his reasons, she doubted she would see Mason Armstrong again. Men of his standing didn't associate with women like her, not beyond a momentary act of kindness. The sound of an approaching horse made her straighten up, shielding her eyes against the morning sun. Her heart jumped when she recognized the chestnut gelding and its rider. Mason Armstrong dismounted at her garden gate, removing his hat as he approached. Today he wore a clean white shirt under his leather vest, and his boots had been polished. He looked every bit the successful cattleman Mrs. Holloway had described. "Good morning, Miss Juárez," he called, stopping at a respectful distance from her garden. Hattie suddenly became acutely aware of her worn work dress and the dirt on her hands. "Mr. Armstrong, this is unexpected. I hope I'm not intruding." He glanced at her garden. "Fine-looking tomatoes you've got there. Thank you." Hattie wiped her hands on her apron, uncertain of what to do with this strange social situation. "Did you need something?" Mason shifted his weight, and Hattie realized with surprise that he seemed nervous. "I was wondering if you might be available to help me with something. A business matter." "A business matter," Hattie repeated, confused. "Yes. I've recently acquired some contracts with cattle buyers in Mexico, but my Spanish isn't what it should be. Mrs. Holloway mentioned you sometimes do translation work." Understanding dawned, and with it came disappointment. Of course he needed a translator. That explained his unusual kindness the day before. He was merely securing her services. "I see," she said, trying to keep her tone neutral. "Yes, I can translate documents if that's what you need." "Excellent." He smiled, seeming genuinely relieved. "I'd pay you well, of course, better than the going rate." "The going rate would be fine, Mr. Armstrong." Hattie's pride wouldn't let her accept charity, even if it was disguised as business. "Mason," he corrected. "And I insist on paying properly for skilled work. These contracts are important." Hattie considered for a moment. The extra money would be welcome, allowing her to repair the leaking roof before the autumn rains came. "When do you need this done?" she asked. "I'm expecting the documents within the week, but there's something else." He hesitated. "I was hoping you might also consider giving me lessons. In Spanish, that is. If I'm going to do more business across the border, I should at least try to speak the language properly." Hattie stared at him in disbelief. A prominent cattleman was standing in her garden asking her to teach him Spanish. It seemed implausible. "There must be others better suited," she said carefully. "Perhaps in San Antonio." "I prefer to do business locally when I can," Mason replied. "And Mrs. Holloway says your English is perfect, which suggests you'd be an excellent teacher." Hattie hesitated. Teaching Mason would mean spending time with him regularly, which would surely invite more gossip and potentially trouble for them both. "People will talk," she warned. Mason's expression hardened slightly. People always talk. I've never much cared for other folks' opinions of my business dealings. This isn't just business, though, is it? Not in their eyes. Hattie gestured between them. A Mexican woman teaching a white cattleman. They'll make it into something inappropriate. Then we'll meet somewhere public. The cafe on Main Street has a back room they rent out for business meetings. Respectable with witnesses, but private enough for lessons. He paused. Unless you're concerned for reasons beyond gossip. The question hung in the air. Was she afraid of him? No, Hattie realized with some surprise. Despite everything she'd learned about being cautious around men, especially white men with power, something about Mason Armstrong felt trustworthy. $3 per lesson, she said finally. Once a week, plus the translation work. Mason's face broke into a genuine smile that transformed his features from handsome to almost boyishly charming. Deal. Shall we say Thursday afternoon for our first lesson? 2 o'clock. Hattie nodded, still not entirely convinced this wasn't some elaborate joke. I'll bring the documents when they arrive, he added, replacing his hat. And Miss Juárez, thank you. As he mounted his horse and rode away, Hattie stood in her garden, wondering what she had just agreed to and how it would change her carefully contained life. She didn't have to wait long to find out. By noon, her neighbor Mrs. Finch had made a special trip across the street. Hattie, dear, the older woman said, her tone dripping with false concern. I couldn't help but notice Mason Armstrong at your home this morning. Is everything all right? Perfectly fine, Mrs. Finch, Hattie replied, continuing to hang her laundry on the line. Mr. Armstrong has hired me for some translation work. Has he now? Mrs. Finch's eyebrows rose nearly to her hairline. Well, that's interesting. You know, dear, men like that successful, unmarried, they sometimes have certain expectations when they hire young women. Hattie's hands stilled on the wet shirt she was hanging. Mr. Armstrong has been nothing but professional and respectful. Of course, dear. Mrs. Finch patted her arm condescendingly. I'm sure he has. But a girl in your position can't be too careful. People already talk, you know. Yes, Mrs. Finch. I'm well aware of what people say about me. The older woman had the decency to look slightly embarrassed. I'm only thinking of your welfare, Hattie. Your poor mother would want someone looking out for you. The mention of her mother stung, as it always did. Consuela Juárez had endured the same prejudices as Hattie, but with a grace and dignity that Hattie still strived to emulate. My mother taught me to judge people by their actions, not their reputations, Hattie said quietly. So far, Mr. Armstrong has shown me only kindness and respect. Mrs. Finch sighed dramatically. Well, I hope you're right, dear, for your sake. She glanced at the small house. By the way, if you ever decide to sell this place, my son might be interested, just in case you need to leave town suddenly. The implication was clear, and Hattie felt her temper flare. Thank you for your concern, Mrs. Finch, but I have no plans to sell my home or leave Fort Worth. After her neighbor finally departed, Hattie sat heavily on her back steps, wondering if she had made a terrible mistake in accepting Mason's offer. The work itself would be straightforward enough, but the social complications already beginning to swirl around her were another matter entirely. By Thursday, the whispers had grown to a dull roar. Hattie felt the stares more intensely than ever as she made her way to the cafe on Main Street for her first lesson with Mason. She had worn her best dress, a dark green cotton with minimal embroidery, and pinned her hair up neatly. Professional, but not trying too hard. The last thing she wanted was to give anyone reason to think she had romantic designs on Mason Armstrong. The cafe owner, Mr. Whitley, directed her to the back room with a curious stare but no comment. Mason was already there, a pot of coffee and 2 cups on the table, along with several books and papers. "Miss Juárez," he said, standing when she entered. "Thank you for coming. Mr. Armstrong." Hattie took the seat he offered, back straight, hands folded in her lap. "I hope you didn't encounter any trouble on your way here." His brow furrowed with what appeared to be genuine concern. "Nothing I'm not accustomed to," she replied, then regretted the bitterness in her tone. "Shall we begin?" For the next hour, Hattie assessed Mason's current knowledge of Spanish, minimal but not completely absent, and began teaching him basic greetings and business terms. He proved to be an attentive student, repeating phrases until his pronunciation improved and taking careful notes. "Your accent is actually quite good," Hattie commented, surprised by his quick progress. "You have an ear for the language." "I've always picked up bits and pieces," Mason admitted. "Working cattle drives, you meet all sorts, but I never had proper instruction." He hesitated. "May I ask you something personal, Miss Juárez?" Hattie tensed slightly. "You may ask. I may not answer." He nodded, accepting her terms. "How long has your family been in Texas?" It wasn't what she had expected. "My parents came from Monterrey 18 years ago. My father was a doctor who trained in Spain. He came here hoping to build a better practice." She gave a small, sad smile. "He didn't anticipate the resistance." "Yet they stayed," Mason observed. "They stayed," Hattie confirmed. "By the time they realized how difficult it would be, they had me, and returning to Mexico seemed more dangerous than remaining. There was political unrest, and my father had already sold his practice there." "And now?" Mason asked gently. "Now they're both gone, and this is the only home I've ever known, even if it doesn't always feel like I belong here." Hattie surprised herself with her candor. She rarely spoke about her parents or her feelings of displacement. Mason was quiet for a moment, looking out the small window at the busy street. "I understand more than you might think," he said finally. Before Hattie could ask what he meant, he changed the subject back to Spanish verbs, and the moment for personal revelations passed. As they concluded the lesson, Mason handed her an envelope. "Your payment, plus a little extra for making the trip into town." Hattie started to protest, but he held up a hand. "It's a business expense, Miss Juárez, nothing more." She accepted the envelope with a nod. "Same time next week." "If that suits you, and I should have those contracts by then as well." He gathered his books. "May I walk you home?" "That's not necessary, I insist. It's getting late." The sun was indeed beginning to set, painting the western sky in brilliant oranges and reds. Hattie hesitated, weighing the potential gossip against the practical safety of having an escort. "Thank you," she finally said. "That would be appreciated." They walked side by side down Main Street, Mason shortening his stride to match hers. The stares were immediate, ranging from curious to hostile. "Don't look now," Mason murmured, "but I believe Mrs. Brewster just dropped her shopping basket in shock." Despite herself, Hattie laughed, a genuine sound that she hadn't heard from herself in some time. "I warned you about the talk." "Let them talk," Mason said simply. "I find I'm enjoying your company too much to care." The comment sent an unexpected warmth through Hattie's chest, one she immediately tried to suppress. Mason Armstrong was being kind, unusually kind, but that didn't mean anything beyond business and perhaps friendship. As they passed the saloon, the same men who had called out the day Mason gave her a ride were lounging outside again. One of them, a wiry man with a pockmarked face, stepped directly into their path. "Well now, if it isn't Armstrong and his Mexican pet," the man drawled, alcohol thick on his breath. "Taking her for a walk, are you?" Mason's posture changed subtly, his body angling slightly in front of Hattie's. "Step aside, Becker. We're just passing through." "Public street," Becker replied with a nasty grin. I'm just curious why a man like you is spending so much time with trash like. He never finished the sentence. Mason moved with a speed Hattie wouldn't have thought possible, grabbing Becker by the collar and slamming him against the saloon wall. The other men started forward, but something in Mason's expression made them reconsider. Miss Juárez is a lady, Mason said quietly, his voice all the more threatening for its calmness. And you will address her with respect, or you won't address her at all. Are we clear? Becker's face had gone white, but he managed a jerky nod. Mason released him and stepped back. Good. Now apologize to the lady. I'm sorry, madam, Becker mumbled, not meeting Hattie's eyes. Mason turned to Hattie, his expression softening. Shall we continue? Too stunned to speak, Hattie nodded. They resumed walking, leaving the saloon behind. It wasn't until they were nearly at her house that she found her voice again. You shouldn't have done that, she said quietly. He insulted you. People insult me every day, Mr. Armstrong. Mason stopped, turning to face her fully. And that makes it acceptable. No, but it makes it dangerous for you to defend me. Those men are cowards who only feel strong when they're belittling others. His blue eyes flashed with an intensity that made Hattie's breath catch. I meant what I said yesterday. Where you're from doesn't matter here. Not to me. In that moment, standing in the fading light with Mason's earnest gaze fixed on her, Hattie felt something shift between them, something that went beyond business or even friendship. Thank you, she said softly. But please be careful. I wouldn't want you to suffer because of me. Mason's expression softened into a smile. I can handle myself, Miss Juárez, but I appreciate your concern. He escorted her the rest of the way home, bidding her good night at her door with a respectful tip of his hat. Hattie watched him walk away, a confusing mixture of emotions swirling inside her. Gratitude, certainly. Concern for the trouble he might face. And something else, something warm and dangerous that she had no business feeling for a man so far beyond her reach. Over the next 3 weeks, their lessons continued. Each Thursday, Hattie would meet Mason at the cafe, teach him for an hour or two, and then he would walk her home. His Spanish improved rapidly, and the promised contracts arrived, keeping Hattie busy with translation work. What also grew was the town's interest in their arrangement. Whispers followed Hattie everywhere she went, some merely curious, others decidedly ugly. Mrs. Finch had taken to watching from her window whenever Mason arrived or departed, and Mr. Peterson at the general store had raised his prices for Hattie yet again. More concerning were the veiled threats. A dead rattlesnake had appeared on her doorstep one morning. A note had been slipped under her door another day, its message simple: go back where you belong. Hattie had burned the note and disposed of the snake without telling Mason, not wanting to worry him or, worse, provoke another confrontation. On the 4th Thursday of their lessons, Mason surprised her by bringing a picnic basket. I thought we might have our lesson outdoors today, he suggested. There's a nice spot by the creek just outside of town. Private, but still proper since it's in full view of the main road. Hattie hesitated. Leaving town with Mason would only fuel the gossip, yet the prospect of escaping the stifling atmosphere of Fort Worth, even briefly, was tempting. I've brought a book of Mexican poetry, Mason added, pulling it from his saddlebag. Thought it might make a good teaching tool, and I'd like to understand it better. That decided her. No one in town had ever shown interest in her cultural heritage beyond stereotypes and prejudice. The fact that Mason had sought out Mexican literature touched her deeply. I'd like that, she said, accepting his help onto his horse. The creek was about a mile outside of town, a peaceful spot where cottonwood trees provided shade and the water gurgled pleasantly over smooth stones. Mason spread a blanket on the grass and unpacked sandwiches, fruit, and a bottle of lemonade. "This is lovely," Hattie said, looking around at the tranquil setting. "How did you find this place?" "I camped here when I first came to Fort Worth," Mason replied, handing her a plate. "5 years ago now. I was just passing through, but something about the town made me want to stay. Even with all its challenges," Hattie asked delicately. Mason's expression grew thoughtful. "Every place has its challenges. Fort Worth is growing fast. Change is coming, whether people like Peterson and Becker want it or not." He looked at her directly. "The railroad's bringing new folks, new ideas. The old ways of thinking won't last forever." "That's a hopeful view," Hattie said, unable to keep the skepticism from her voice. "I'm generally a hopeful person." Mason smiled. "Had to be, given where I started." "And where was that?" Hattie asked, realizing she knew very little about his background. Mason was quiet for a moment, breaking a piece of bread into smaller portions. "Missouri originally. But my family moved around a lot. My father was not a stable man. Drank too much, couldn't hold a job. We ended up in Kansas when I was 16, and that's where I got my start in cattle." "As a drover?" Hattie asked. Mason nodded. "Lowest position you can have on a drive. Eating dust all day, sleeping on the ground all night for barely enough pay to feed yourself. But I learned the business from the ground up." A shadow crossed his face. "Lost my parents in a typhoid outbreak a year later. Been on my own ever since." "I'm sorry," Hattie said softly. "It must have been hard, being alone so young." "It was," he acknowledged. "But it taught me something important, that a person's worth isn't determined by where they came from or who their family was. It's about what they do, how they treat others." He looked at her with such intensity that Hattie had to glance away, suddenly conscious of how close they were sitting on the blanket. "May I see the poetry book?" she asked, changing the subject. Mason handed it to her, their fingers brushing briefly. Hattie opened it to find a collection of verses by Sor Juana Inés Acutes de la Cruz, a 17th-century Mexican poet and nun. "This is beautiful," she said, genuinely surprised. "Where did you get it?" "Ordered it from a bookseller in San Antonio," Mason admitted. "I asked around about important Mexican writers." Hattie ran her fingers over the pages, touched beyond words. "My mother loved Sor Juana. She used to recite her poems to me when I was little." "Would you read one?" Mason asked. "In Spanish first, then help me understand it." Hattie nodded, turning to a familiar poem. She began to read, her voice gaining confidence as the beautiful words flowed from her lips. The sound of her native language, spoken freely and without fear of judgment, was like a release. When she finished, she looked up to find Mason watching her with an expression that made her heart beat faster. "That was beautiful," he said quietly. "Even without understanding all the words, I could feel the meaning." Hattie translated the poem, a verse about the nature of love and absence, explaining the nuances of the language as she went. Mason listened attentively, asking questions that showed genuine interest rather than mere politeness. As the afternoon progressed, their conversation flowed more easily, moving from language lessons to personal stories. Hattie found herself telling Mason about her childhood, her father's medical practice, her mother's embroidery that had taught Hattie her own skills with a needle. In turn, Mason shared tales of cattle drives, of sleeping under the stars in Kansas, of the first herd he bought with his own savings. The sun was beginning to lower in the sky when Mason suddenly sat up straighter, his attention caught by something on the main road. "Riders," he said, his tone changing. "4 of them heading this way." Hattie turned to look, her stomach tightening when she recognized Becker among the approaching horsemen. The men were riding fast, and their trajectory left little doubt that they had spotted Mason and Hattie. "We should go," Hattie said, already gathering their things. Mason nodded, quickly packing the remains of their picnic. He helped Hattie onto his horse and mounted behind her just as the riders approached. "Well now, what do we have here?" Becker called, his words slurred despite the early hour. "A private lesson, Armstrong." The other men laughed, spreading out to block the path back to town. Hattie felt Mason tense behind her, his arm tightening slightly around her waist. "We're just heading back to town," Mason said evenly. "Move aside, gentlemen." "Don't think we will," said one of the other men, a heavy-set fellow with a patchy beard. "Not until we have a little chat about the company you're keeping." "My associations are my business," Mason replied, his voice hard. "Now move aside before this becomes something you'll regret." "Big talk," Becker sneered. "But you're outnumbered, Armstrong, and we're just looking out for the town's interests. Ain't right, a respectable businessman like yourself sullying his reputation with Mexican trash." Hattie felt Mason's body coil like a spring. "Careful, Becker. That's twice now you've insulted Miss Juárez in my presence. There won't be a third time." The tension in the air was palpable. Hattie's heart hammered in her chest, fear not just for herself but for Mason as well. 4 against 1 were not odds in his favor, regardless of his apparent confidence. "Please," she whispered, "it's not worth it." "You're wrong," Mason murmured back. "It is." Before the situation could escalate further, the sound of another horse approaching drew everyone's attention. Sheriff Taylor rode into view, his expression grim as he took in the scene. "Problem here?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "No problem at all, Sheriff," Becker said, suddenly the picture of innocence. "Just having a friendly conversation with Armstrong and his friend." Sheriff Taylor's eyes moved from Becker to Mason and Hattie, lingering on her with a frown. "Mr. Armstrong, Miss Juárez, everything all right?" "We were just returning to town, Sheriff," Mason said calmly. "These gentlemen were about to move along and let us pass." The sheriff studied the situation for a long moment before nodding. "Becker, you and your friends head on back to town. Now." There was enough authority in his voice that even Becker didn't argue, though he shot Mason a look of pure malice before turning his horse around. The others followed, one of them spitting on the ground near Mason's horse as he passed. Once they were out of earshot, Sheriff Taylor turned to Mason. "Armstrong, a word of advice. Whatever this arrangement is, it's causing talk. Bad talk." "With all due respect, Sheriff, the talk is not my concern," Mason replied. "Maybe it should be," the sheriff countered. "For both your sakes." His gaze shifted to Hattie. "Miss Juárez, I suggest you consider your position carefully. Fort Worth is changing, but not that fast." With that cryptic warning, he tipped his hat and rode after Becker's group, leaving Mason and Hattie alone. The ride back to town was tense and mostly silent. Hattie's mind raced with worry not just about the immediate danger from men like Becker, but about the longer-term consequences for both her and Mason. She had already lost so much. The thought of causing Mason harm because of their association was unbearable. When they reached her house, Mason helped her down from the horse but kept hold of her hand even after her feet touched the ground. "Hattie," he said, using her first name for the first time. "I want you to know that I don't regret a single moment of our time together, regardless of what anyone says." The sincerity in his voice made her throat tight with emotion. "Mason, I know what you're going to say," he interrupted gently. "That it's too dangerous, that we should stop the lessons, that I shouldn't be seen with you. But I'm asking you not to say it. Not yet." Hattie looked up at him, at the determination in his blue eyes, and felt her resolve wavering. The connection between them had grown stronger with each meeting, evolving into something she had never expected to find in Fort Worth or anywhere else. "I don't want anything to happen to you because of me," she said finally. Mason's hand tightened around hers. And I don't want to let fear dictate my life or who I choose to spend my time with. He paused. Next week. One more lesson, at least, please. How could she refuse when he looked at her like that? When he had defended her, sought out her culture's literature, treated her with a respect she had rarely known in this town. One more lesson, she agreed softly. Mason's smile was like the sunrise. Thursday, 2 o'clock. He mounted his horse and rode away, leaving Hattie standing at her door with the unsettling feeling that her carefully constructed life was about to change irrevocably for better or worse. She couldn't yet say. That night, as Hattie prepared for bed, a crash from her front room sent her heart into her throat. She grabbed a heavy iron poker from beside the fireplace and crept toward the noise, only to find her front window shattered, a large rock lying amid broken glass on her floor. Attached to the rock was a note, its message chilling in its simplicity: "Leave town or burn." Hattie's hands trembled as she picked up the note. This was different from the previous threats, more direct, more violent. She glanced out the broken window but saw only darkness. Whoever had thrown the rock was already gone. For hours, she sat awake in her kitchen, the poker across her lap, jumping at every sound. By morning, exhaustion had dulled her fear enough that she could think clearly again. She cleaned up the glass and boarded the window as best she could, but the question remained. What should she do now? Running seemed the obvious answer. She could sell the house to Mrs. Finch's son, take what money she had saved and go. Where? Back to Mexico, where she knew no one. To San Antonio, where at least there were others of Mexican descent, but where she would still be alone and starting over. Or she could stay and face whatever came, as her parents had done. The thought of Mason gave her pause. In just a few weeks, he had become important to her in ways she hadn't anticipated. The prospect of never seeing him again left an ache in her chest that surprised her with its intensity. By the time Thursday arrived, Hattie still hadn't made a decision. She went to the cafe as agreed, half expecting Mason not to show up, convinced that someone in town must have warned him away from her by now. But there he was, waiting at their usual table, his face lighting up when she entered. He rose immediately, then frowned as he took in her appearance. "What's happened?" he asked, his voice low with concern. "You look exhausted." Hattie glanced around the cafe, aware of the other patrons watching them. "Not here," she murmured. Mason nodded, understanding immediately. "Let's go somewhere else." They left the cafe, Mason leading the way to the livery stable where he kept his horse. "We can talk privately here," he said, guiding her to a bench just inside the stable doors, still visible from the street but out of earshot of passers-by. Hattie told him about the rock, the note, the night spent in fear. Mason's expression darkened with each word, his hands clenching into fists on his knees. "This has gone far enough," he said when she finished. "I'll speak to the sheriff." "And what will that accomplish?" Hattie interrupted. Sheriff Taylor made his position clear. He's more concerned about the talk than about actual threats. "Then I'll deal with this myself," Mason declared, starting to rise. Hattie caught his arm. "No, Mason. That's exactly what they want, an excuse to come after you directly." She took a deep breath. "I've been thinking that maybe it would be best if I left Fort Worth." The change in Mason's expression was immediate and stark shock, followed by something that looked remarkably like panic. "Leave? Hattie, no. What choice do I have?" she asked, the weariness of years of prejudice weighing on her voice. "This town has never accepted me. I've stayed because it was my parents' home, but they're gone now. Nothing is keeping me here." Mason stared at her for a long moment, something clearly warring behind his eyes. Then, to Hattie's surprise, he took both her hands in his. "What if there was something keeping you here?" he asked softly. "Someone," Hattie's breath caught. Mason. I know this is sudden, he continued quickly. And maybe I'm a fool for not saying it sooner, but I've been trying to be respectful to give you time. But the truth is, Hattie Juárez, I've been falling for you since the moment you stood up to Peterson in his store, with your head high despite his rudeness. Hattie stared at him, unable to believe what she was hearing. You can't mean that. I do. His blue eyes held her steadily. I admire your strength, your intelligence, the grace with which you face a town that doesn't deserve you. I look forward to our meetings more than anything else in my week, and the thought of you leaving. He shook his head. I can't bear it. Tears pricked at Hattie's eyes. Mason, even if what you say is true, it doesn't change the reality we face. This town will never accept us together. Then we'll change the town, he said with such conviction that for a moment Hattie almost believed it possible. Or we'll go somewhere else, together. You would leave your business. Everything you've built here. Mason squeezed her hands. What good is success if I can't share it with someone I care about? Someone who sees me for who I am, not what I own. The sincerity in his voice broke something open inside Hattie, a wall she had built around her heart years ago, when she first understood that her heritage made her unwelcome in the only home she had ever known. I care for you too, she admitted quietly. More than I should, but I'm afraid, Mason. Not just of the threats, but of what loving you would mean, for both of us. It means we face whatever comes together, he said simply. Starting now, he stood, still holding her hands. Come with me. There's something I need to show you. Curiosity overcame Hattie's reservations. She let Mason help her onto his horse, and they rode out of town, taking a different direction than their previous excursion to the creek. After about 20 minutes, they crested a small hill, and Mason drew the horse to a stop. Below them stretched a beautiful valley, with a clear stream running through its center. A half-built structure stood near the water, the beginnings of what looked like a substantial house. What is this place? Hattie asked, taking in the peaceful scene. My land, Mason replied, a note of pride in his voice. Purchased it last year. I've been building a proper home bit by bit. He hesitated. I'd planned to bring you here eventually, to show you what I'm working toward. Hattie looked at the partially constructed house, the fertile valley, the hills that would provide natural protection for cattle. It's beautiful, she said honestly. It could be a new start, Mason said quietly. For both of us, away from town but close enough for business when needed. He turned to look at her directly. I'm not asking for an answer now, just asking you to consider the possibility before you decide to leave. The offer hung between them, full of promise and uncertainty. Hattie found herself imagining a life here, a home she helped build, children running by the stream, Mason returning from his cattle business to a family of his own. It was a vision so enticing it made her heart ache. I need time, she said finally. To think. Of course, Mason nodded. Take all the time you need. Just know that whatever you decide, I'll support you. And if you choose to go, I'll make sure you're safe wherever you want to settle. They rode back toward town in companionable silence, each lost in thought. As they approached the outskirts, Mason suddenly tensed, pulling the horse to a stop. Smoke, he said, his voice tight. Hattie followed his gaze and felt her blood turn to ice. A thick column of black smoke rose from the direction of her house. No, she whispered. Mason spurred the horse into a gallop, and Hattie clung to him as they raced toward the smoke. They arrived to find her worst fears confirmed. Her small house was engulfed in flames, the fire burning hot enough that they could feel its heat from the street. A crowd had gathered, watching but making no effort to extinguish the blaze. Sheriff Taylor stood at the edge of the crowd, his expression grim as Mason and Hattie dismounted. Was anyone inside? Mason demanded, his voice tight with controlled panic. No, the sheriff replied. House was empty when it started. Relief flooded through Hattie, followed immediately by despair as she watched everything she owned, every reminder of her parents, every piece of her history consumed by flames. Who did this? Mason asked, his tone dangerously calm. Sheriff Taylor shook his head. No witnesses have come forward. Could have been an accident. This was no accident, Mason cut him off. And we both know it. Some of the onlookers were staring at Hattie with expressions ranging from pity to satisfaction. Mrs. Finch caught her eye and quickly looked away, her face flushed with what might have been shame. Everything I had, Hattie murmured, watching as the roof of her childhood home collapsed in a shower of sparks. Everything from my parents. Mason's arm came around her shoulders, a public declaration that sent a ripple of whispers through the crowd. You're alive, he said firmly. That's what matters. Where will she go now? Someone in the crowd asked loudly. Back where she belongs, I expect, another voice answered, not bothering to lower its volume. Mason's arm tightened around Hattie. Sheriff, he said clearly, loud enough for everyone to hear. I'm formally reporting this as arson and a threat against Miss Juárez. I expect a full investigation. Sheriff Taylor looked uncomfortable. Armstrong without witnesses. Then find some, Mason interrupted. Because if the law won't deliver justice, I'll find my own way. The threat hung in the air, causing another stir among the onlookers. Sheriff Taylor's expression hardened. Is that wise, Armstrong, making threats in front of witnesses? Not a threat, Sheriff. A promise. Mason turned to Hattie, his voice softening. Come on, you'll stay at my place in town tonight. It's secure and I have spare rooms. Hattie knew she should refuse, that accepting his offer would only cement the town's belief that they were involved in a scandalous relationship, but she had nowhere else to go. And the thought of being alone tonight was unbearable. Thank you, she whispered. As Mason helped her back onto his horse, a voice called out from the crowd. Armstrong. It was Becker, his face flushed with drink even in the middle of the day. Your Mexican whore got what was coming to her. Next time it'll be you. What happened next was so quick Hattie barely registered it. Mason was off the horse in an instant, crossing the space between them in long strides. His fist connected with Becker's jaw with a sickening crack, sending the smaller man sprawling in the dirt. That's assault, Becker howled, blood streaming from his split lip. And that's a confession, Mason replied coldly, turning to Sheriff Taylor. You heard him. He just admitted to burning Miss Juárez's house and threatening both of us. The sheriff looked torn, glancing between Mason's rigid stance and Becker's bloody face. Both of you calm down. Are you going to arrest him or not? Mason demanded. He just confessed to arson in front of 20 witnesses. He didn't exactly confess. Then arrest me, Mason interrupted. For assault. Do your job, Sheriff, one way or the other. The standoff stretched for a long moment, the crowd watching with bated breath. Finally, Sheriff Taylor sighed heavily. Becker, you're coming with me, he said. We're going to have a long talk about arson and making threats. He glanced at Mason. And you'd be wise to cool off, Armstrong. This isn't over. As the sheriff led a protesting Becker away, Mason returned to Hattie, who had watched the entire exchange in stunned silence. I'm sorry you had to see that, he said quietly, remounting behind her. But I'm not sorry I did it. Hattie leaned back against him, too overwhelmed to respond. Together they rode away from the smoldering ruins of her home, toward an uncertain future but one they would face together. Mason's house in town was modest but well appointed, reflecting his success without being ostentatious. He showed Hattie to a comfortable guest room, then left her alone to settle in while he prepared a simple dinner. Sitting on the edge of the bed, the events of the day crashed over Hattie in waves. She had lost everything, every memento of her parents, every item she had worked for, every piece of the life she had built. Yet somehow, amid that devastating loss, she had gained something unexpected, a clear understanding of Mason Armstrong's feelings for her and the courage to acknowledge her own for him. When she emerged from the room, Mason was setting a pot of stew on the table. He looked up when she entered, his expression softening. "I hope you're hungry," he said. "It's nothing fancy, but it's hot." "It smells wonderful," Hattie replied, taking the seat he offered. "Thank you, Mason, for everything." They ate quietly for a few minutes before Mason broke the silence. "I've been thinking about what happened today, about what Becker said." Hattie tensed. "What about it?" "He threatened both of us, not just you. Which means this isn't just about prejudice against Mexicans anymore. It's about us together." Mason looked at her steadily. "And I need to know if that changes your mind about staying." Hattie considered the question carefully. The burning of her home had changed everything, removing her physical ties to Fort Worth while simultaneously crystallizing the danger of remaining. "I don't know," she admitted. "Part of me wants to run as far from this town as possible, but another part, Mason prompted when she trailed off. Hattie met his gaze. "Another part can't bear the thought of leaving you." The simple truth hung between them, raw and vulnerable. Mason reached across the table and took her hand. "Then don't," he said softly. "Stay, not necessarily in town, but here in the territory, on the land I showed you today." He hesitated. "With me?" "As what, Mason?" Hattie asked, needing clarity despite the boldness of the question. "Your housekeeper, your friend." Mason's grip tightened on her hand. "As my wife, Hattie, if you'll have me." The words struck her with physical force, stealing her breath. "Your wife, Mason, we barely know each other." "I know enough," he said with quiet certainty. "I know you're strong and proud and kind. I know you face each day with more courage than most people show in a lifetime. I know that when I'm with you, I feel like I've finally found what I've been working toward all these years." He paused. "And I know that I love you, Hattie Juárez." Tears filled Hattie's eyes, emotions too complex to name washing through her. "The town would never accept it." "We wouldn't be in town," Mason reminded her. "We'd be on my land building something new together." He squeezed her hand. "Think about it, Hattie. No more stares, no more whispers. Just us, making our own life on our own terms." The vision was almost too beautiful to contemplate a life free from the daily burden of prejudice, with a man who saw her true worth, who defended her without hesitation, who looked at her with love despite everything the world said about her origins. "If I say yes," Hattie said carefully, "what happens next?" Hope bloomed in Mason's eyes. "We'd get married quietly by a judge if you prefer. I'd finish building the house with your input on what you want. You could still do translation work, teach Spanish to others if you wish. We'd build a good life, Hattie, a life where who you are is celebrated, not condemned. And children." The question slipped out before she could stop it. "If you want them," Mason replied without hesitation. "They'd be beautiful, Hattie, strong like their mother, and mixed," she pointed out. "They would face their own challenges." "They would," Mason acknowledged honestly, "but they'd face them with parents who understand, who would teach them to be proud of all parts of their heritage. And the world is changing, Hattie. Slowly, yes, but it is changing." Hattie took a deep breath, her heart racing. Was she truly considering this? Marriage to a man she had known for barely a month, moving to an isolated homestead, building a life that would challenge everything society expected. "I need time," she said finally. "Not to decide if I care for you. I do, more than I thought possible in so short a time. But it's everything, Mason. My whole life would change." "Of course," he said immediately. "Take all the time you need. You're welcome to stay here as long as necessary with no expectations." He hesitated. "Though for propriety's sake, perhaps we should tell people you're staying with Mrs. Holloway instead." Hattie smiled slightly at his concern for her reputation, even now. "Thank you." "Whatever you decide, Hattie," Mason said, his voice earnest, "know that my feelings won't change. And neither will my respect for you." In that moment, looking into his sincere blue eyes, Hattie knew what her answer would be, had perhaps known it since that first day in Peterson's store, when Mason had defended her without even knowing her name. But she would give herself the time to be certain, to consider all that marriage to him would mean. The next morning, Sheriff Taylor arrived at Mason's door. His expression was grim as Mason invited him in. "Becker's been released," he said without preamble. "Insufficient evidence to hold him for the fire." Mason's jaw tightened. "He confessed in front of 20 people. He was drunk, and he claims he was just running his mouth. No one's willing to testify they saw him or anyone else start the fire." The sheriff sighed. "I'm not happy about it either, Armstrong, but my hands are tied." "So he gets away with it," Mason said flatly. "For now," Sheriff Taylor conceded, "but I've warned him and his friends to stay away from both of you." He glanced toward the kitchen, where Hattie was preparing breakfast. "Miss Juárez, I'm truly sorry about your home. If there's anything the town can do to assist, the town has done quite enough, Sheriff," Hattie replied quietly. "But thank you." After the sheriff left, Mason and Hattie discussed their options. With Becker free and likely seeking revenge, staying in town seemed increasingly dangerous. "I should go to my land today," Mason decided. "Check on things, make sure everything's secure. Will you be all right here alone?" Hattie hesitated, then made a decision. "I'd like to come with you if that's all right. To see the place again, properly this time." Mason's face lit up. "Of course. We can pack some food, make a day of it." The ride to Mason's land was pleasant despite the circumstances. It was a beautiful late June day, with a breeze that took the edge off the Texas heat. As they approached the valley, Hattie saw the property with new eyes, not just as a beautiful piece of land, but as a potential home. The half-built house was larger than she'd initially realized, with a stone foundation and solid wooden framing. Mason led her through the structure, pointing out where each room would be a spacious kitchen, a comfortable sitting room, 3 bedrooms upstairs. "I've been working on it whenever I can get away from town," he explained. "Hired some help for the heavy work, but I've done a lot myself." "It's wonderful," Hattie said honestly. "You've thought of everything." "Not everything," Mason replied with a smile. "I left plenty of decisions unmade, hoping someday I'd have someone to make them with me." They spent the afternoon exploring the property, the creek where Mason planned to build a water wheel, the fields where he would plant crops alongside raising cattle, the stand of trees that would provide shade and windbreak. As the sun began to lower in the sky, they sat on the partially finished porch, sharing bread and cold chicken Mason had packed. Hattie felt more at peace than she had in years, despite the uncertainty of her situation. "I could be happy here," she said softly, almost to herself. Mason turned to her, hope written plainly on his face. "You could," Hattie nodded slowly. "Yes, I think I could." She took a deep breath. "Mason, I don't need more time. I know what I want." "And what is that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "You," she said simply. "This place. A future we build together." She met his gaze steadily. "If your offer still stands, I'd like to accept it." Mason's face transformed with joy. He took her hands in his, bringing them to his lips. "Nothing would make me happier, Hattie Juárez, than to make you my wife." Their first kiss was gentle, a promise of the love that had grown between them against all odds. When they pulled apart, both were smiling despite the tears in their eyes. "We should head back before dark," Mason said reluctantly. "Tomorrow we can start making plans." The ride back to town was filled with quiet conversation about practical matters, how soon the house could be finished, what supplies they would need, whether to have a small wedding or simply visit the judge. The future that had seemed so bleak that morning now stretched before them, full of possibility. They were within sight of town when Mason suddenly pulled his horse to a stop, his body tensing. "Something's wrong," he said, nodding toward Fort Worth. Hattie followed his gaze and saw what had alarmed him: a group of riders, at least 6 men, heading toward them at a gallop. Even from a distance, she recognized Becker among them. "Mason," she breathed, fear clutching at her throat. "Stay calm," he said, though his own voice was tight. "We'll turn back, head for the Johnsons' farm. It's closest." But before they could turn, shots rang out, warning shots fired into the air but clear in their message. The men were coming for them. "No time," Mason muttered. He urged his horse forward, away from the road and toward a stand of trees that would provide some cover. "Hold on tight." Hattie gripped his waist as the horse broke into a gallop, heading away from both the approaching riders and town. Behind them, she could hear shouts and more hoofbeats as the men gave chase. They reached the trees, Mason guiding the horse skillfully through the underbrush. "There's a ravine ahead," he said over his shoulder. "If we can reach it, we can follow it to the river, lose them in the water." The plan made sense, but Hattie could hear the pursuers gaining on them. More shots rang out, closer this time. "They're shooting at us," she cried. "They're drunk and riding hard. Their aim is poor," Mason replied, though the strain in his voice betrayed his concern. Just a little further, a shot cracked through the air and Mason's body jerked. He swayed in the saddle and Hattie gasped in horror as blood bloomed on his left shoulder. "Mason, I'm all right," he gritted out, though his face had gone pale. "Hold the reins." Hattie reached around him, taking control of the horse as Mason pressed his right hand to the wound. They broke through the trees to find the ravine. Mason had mentioned a steep-sided gully with a small stream at its bottom. "Down there," Mason directed, his voice weakening. "Follow it northeast." Hattie guided the horse down the steep bank and into the shallow water, turning northeast as instructed. Behind them, she could hear the pursuers reaching the ravine's edge, their shouts echoing off the walls. "They won't follow right away," Mason said, leaning heavily against her now. "Too steep for a direct descent on horseback. They'll have to find an easier way down." They followed the ravine for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, the water masking their trail. Eventually, the walls lowered and the ravine widened into a broader floodplain. "There," Mason pointed with his good arm. "That stand of cottonwoods, we can rest there." Hattie helped him dismount, alarmed at how much blood had soaked his shirt. She tore strips from her petticoat to bind the wound, her hands shaking but determined. "How bad is it?" Mason asked, his face ashen. "The bullet went through your shoulder," Hattie replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "Clean exit wound, which is good, but you've lost a lot of blood." Mason nodded, wincing as she tightened the makeshift bandage. "We need to keep moving. They'll be searching." "You need a doctor," Hattie insisted. "We should try to circle back to town." "Can't," Mason said firmly. "Becker and his friends would find us before we reached help." He grimaced in pain as he shifted position. "My land. It's closer now and there are supplies there. We can hole up in the house until it's safe." Hattie wanted to argue, to insist on finding proper medical help, but she knew he was right. They were vulnerable in the open, and Mason was in no condition for a prolonged ride to town. "All right," she agreed, "but you'll ride and I'll walk." "You need to conserve your strength." "We both ride," Mason countered. "You don't know the way well enough yet, and I can't hold the reins on my own." The compromise was that Hattie would sit in front, controlling the horse while Mason sat behind her, his good arm around her waist for stability. They set off toward his land, taking a circuitous route that avoided open areas where they might be spotted. Night was falling by the time they reached the half-built house, the structure a welcome sight despite its incomplete state. Mason was barely conscious, slumping against Hattie's back, his breathing shallow. With effort, Hattie got him inside and onto a pallet of blankets in what would someday be the sitting room. The wound had stopped bleeding but looked angry and hot to the touch. Infection was setting in. "There's a medical kit," Mason murmured, his eyes unfocused. "In the storage chest, corner of the room." Hattie found the kit surprisingly well stocked with bandages, alcohol, and basic medicines. Her father had been a doctor, and though she had no formal training, she had assisted him enough to know the basics of wound care. Working by the light of a single lantern, she cleaned the wound thoroughly, applied a poultice, and rebandaged Mason's shoulder. He bore the pain stoically, only a sharp intake of breath revealing his suffering. "You should have been a doctor like your father," he said as she finished, his voice weak but his eyes clearer. "I wanted to be," Hattie admitted, "but no medical school would accept a Mexican woman." Mason's good hand found hers. "Someday they will, and our daughter, if we have one, will have choices we never had." The casual mention of their future children, spoken even in his weakened state, filled Hattie with a fierce determination. They would have that future, would build that life together, but first, they had to survive the night. She gave Mason water and the strongest pain medication in the kit, then settled beside him to wait out the dark hours. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the unfinished walls and masking any sounds of pursuit. Hattie prayed the storm would make it harder for Becker and his men to track them. Mason drifted in and out of consciousness, his skin hot with fever. Hattie bathed his forehead with cool water from the creek, whispering reassurances in Spanish and English. In his lucid moments, he told her where things were stored: food, weapons, tools they might need. "If I don't make it," he said during one such moment, his voice unnervingly calm, "this land is yours. Papers in my desk in town name you as my beneficiary, made the changes last week." "Don't talk like that," Hattie said fiercely. "You're going to be fine." Mason smiled weakly. "Just being practical. Wanted you to know you'll be taken care of whatever happens." His eyes drifted closed again. "Te amo, Hattie." The Spanish phrase, spoken in his Texas accent but with perfect sincerity, brought tears to her eyes. "I love you too," she whispered. "So you have to live, in teens. You have to live so we can build our home." Sometime in the deepest part of the night, Mason's fever broke. His breathing eased and his sleep became more natural. Hattie allowed herself to doze, one hand on his chest to feel the reassuring beat of his heart. Dawn brought a new challenge. As Hattie stepped outside to fetch fresh water, she spotted dust on the horizon riders, approaching from the direction of town. Her heart raced as she hurried back inside. Mason was awake, looking pale but more alert than he had been since the shooting. "Riders coming," she reported, trying to keep her voice calm. "At least 4, maybe more." Mason struggled to sit up. "Help me stand. There's a rifle in that trunk." "You can't fight," Hattie protested. "You can barely sit upright." "I can shoot well enough with one arm," he insisted. "And they don't know that I'm injured. Seeing me on my feet might make them reconsider." It was a desperate plan, but they had few options. Hattie helped Mason to the doorway, where he could lean against the frame for support. She retrieved the rifle and loaded it as he had taught her during their time together. "Stay inside," Mason instructed. "If things go badly, take the horse and ride northeast. There's a ranger station about 15 miles that way." Hattie shook her head firmly. "I'm not leaving you." Before Mason could argue, the riders came into clear view. To their surprise, it wasn't Becker and his men. Sheriff Taylor led the group, accompanied by 3 deputies and, unexpectedly, Mrs. Holloway from the seamstress shop. Armstrong, the sheriff called, reining in his horse at a respectful distance. "Miss Juárez, you in there?" Mason lowered the rifle slightly. "What do you want, Sheriff?" "Making sure you're both all right," Taylor replied. "Town's in an uproar. Becker and his boys came back last night, drunk and angry, bragging about running you out of the territory." His eyes narrowed as he took in Mason's pallor and the way he leaned against the doorframe. "You're hurt." "I'll live," Mason said shortly. "No thanks to Becker and his friends, Mrs." Holloway dismounted and approached, her usually stern face creased with worry. "Miss Juárez, are you harmed?" "I'm fine," Hattie assured her, stepping out beside Mason. "But Mr. Armstrong was shot. He needs a doctor." "That's why we brought Doc Wilson," Sheriff Taylor said, nodding to one of the men in his party. "Mrs. Holloway was worried when you didn't return to town last night. She came to my office this morning, insisted we form a search party." The older seamstress looked almost embarrassed by the sheriff's explanation. "I've always thought highly of you, dear," she said to Hattie. "You're my best embroiderer, and when I heard what Becker was saying—" She trailed off, shaking her head. Doc Wilson approached, medical bag in hand. "Let's have a look at that shoulder, Armstrong." While the doctor examined Mason inside the house, Sheriff Taylor explained the situation to Hattie. Becker and his friends had returned to town celebrating what they called a successful hunt, only to find that their actions had crossed a line for many of Fort Worth's citizens. "Mrs. Holloway wasn't the only one upset," Taylor said. "Mr. Peterson himself came to me, said they'd gone too far. Even folks who weren't comfortable with. Well, with you two together, they draw the line at shooting a man in cold blood." "So what happens now?" Hattie asked. "Becker tried to kill us. Will he face consequences this time?" "He will," the sheriff assured her. "I've got 2 deputies bringing him and his friends in as we speak. Attempted murder's a hanging offense, Miss Juárez. This isn't about prejudice or gossip anymore." Doc Wilson emerged from the house, wiping his hands on a cloth. "He'll be all right," he reported. "Bullet went clean through, no major damage. He's lucky. Another inch to the right, it would have hit his lung." He looked at Hattie with newfound respect. "You did good work cleaning and bandaging that wound, kept infection at bay." "My father was a doctor," Hattie explained quietly. "I learned a little from him." "More than a little, I'd say," Wilson replied. "Armstrong says you saved his life." Mrs. Holloway stepped forward. "Miss Juárez, I've brought some of your things, items people saved from the fire." She handed Hattie a small bundle. "It's not much, I'm afraid." The blaze took most everything. Hattie unwrapped the bundle with trembling hands to find a few pieces of her mother's embroidery, a book that had belonged to her father, and remarkably, the poetry volume Mason had given her. She looked up in surprise. "You had left it at my shop for safekeeping," Mrs. Holloway explained. "The day before the fire." Tears pricked at Hattie's eyes. These small remnants of her past, saved by people she had thought indifferent to her suffering, were precious beyond measure. "Thank you," she whispered. Sheriff Taylor cleared his throat. "We should get back to town, get Armstrong to a proper bed where he can recover." He glanced at the half-built house. "Unless you'd prefer to stay here." Hattie looked at the structure that would someday be their home. "No, he needs proper care for now. We'll come back when he's stronger." The pronouns slipped out naturally, a declaration of their future together. Mrs. Holloway nodded as if a decision had been made. "You'll both stay with me," she announced. "I have plenty of room, and it's more proper than Miss Juárez staying at Mr. Armstrong's house, given the circumstances." The offer surprised Hattie. That's very kind, but we wouldn't want to impose nonsense, the seamstress interrupted. It's decided. She lowered her voice. And if you're to be married, as I suspect you might be, we'll need to start work on a proper dress. Hattie blushed, but didn't deny it. How did you know? Mrs. Holloway smiled, the expression softening her usually stern features. The way he looks at you, dear, and the way you look at him. Some things transcend language and origin. She patted Hattie's hand. Now, let's get that man of yours back to town and on the mend. You have a house to finish building. The journey back to Fort Worth was slow and careful, with Mason riding in a wagon the search party had brought along. Hattie stayed by his side, watching for signs of renewed bleeding or fever. As they approached the town limits, Hattie tensed, expecting the usual stares and whispers. They came, but something was different. There was curiosity, yes, and some disapproval, but also something new, respect, and in some faces, something like shame. Word of Becker's violence had spread, it seemed, along with the story of Hattie and Mason's escape. The town was being forced to confront its prejudices in the harsh light of their consequences. Mrs. Holloway's home was comfortable and well-appointed, reflecting her success as one of Fort Worth's premier seamstresses. She gave Mason her best guest room and Hattie a smaller room across the hall, maintaining propriety while allowing them to be close. For 2 weeks, Mason recovered under Hattie's careful nursing. His strength returned gradually, and by the end of June, he was able to move about with minimal discomfort. During this time, the town buzzed with the news of Becker and his friend's arrest and pending trial. Sheriff Taylor visited regularly, updating them on the legal proceedings. "They'll hang," he said bluntly during one such visit. "Attempted murder, arson, making threats the judge isn't inclined to be lenient, especially given their bragging about the shooting." "And the town?" Mason asked. "What's the mood?" Taylor sighed. "Mixed. Some folks are saying Becker went too far, that violence wasn't the answer even if they didn't approve of your relationship." He glanced between Mason and Hattie. "Others are standing by him, saying he was just protecting the town's values." "And what do you think, Sheriff?" Hattie asked quietly. Taylor was silent for a long moment before answering. "I think the law is the law, Miss Juárez, and it applies equally to everyone, regardless of where they come from." He stood to leave. "I also think that times are changing, whether Fort Worth is ready or not. The railroad's bringing new people, new ideas. 10 years from now, this town might be a very different place." After the sheriff left, Mason took Hattie's hand. "He's right, you know, change is coming. Maybe we're just a little ahead of our time." Hattie smiled, squeezing his hand. "Perhaps. But I wouldn't change anything, despite all that's happened." "No," Mason raised an eyebrow, "not even getting shot at and nearly killed." "Well, perhaps that part," Hattie conceded with a small laugh. "But the rest, meeting you, learning to trust again, finding someone who sees me for who I am rather than where I come from, I wouldn't change that for anything." Mason brought her hand to his lips. "Nor would I." His expression grew serious. "The doctor says I'll be fully recovered within another week or 2. I've been thinking about what we should do next." "And what have you decided?" Hattie asked. "That it's not my decision alone," Mason replied. "It's ours. We could stay in Fort Worth, face down the prejudice together. We could move to my land right away, live in the partially built house while we finish it, or we could leave entirely, start fresh somewhere else." He looked at her steadily. "What do you want, Hattie?" It was a question no one had ever asked her before, what she wanted, truly wanted for her future. The realization that she now had choices and a partner who valued her input equally with his own was overwhelming. "I want to stay," she said after careful consideration. "Not necessarily in town, but in this territory. Your land, our land, is beautiful, and it feels right to build something there." She paused. But I also want to finish what we started here. Show the people of Fort Worth that their prejudice can't defeat us. Mason smiled, a slow, genuine smile that lit his eyes. I was hoping you'd say that. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. I had this delivered from San Antonio. Was planning to give it to you properly when I was back on my feet, but I can't wait any longer. He opened the box to reveal a ring, a simple gold band set with a small but perfect diamond. Hattie Juárez, will you marry me? Officially, properly, with a ceremony and witnesses and all the things you deserve. Tears filled Hattie's eyes as she nodded. Yes, Mason. Yes, I will marry you. He slipped the ring onto her finger, then pulled her into a gentle embrace, mindful of his healing shoulder. Mrs. Holloway has already offered to help with a dress, Hattie murmured against his chest. I think she's appointed herself our champion. Mason chuckled. We could do worse for an ally. She's respected in town and not afraid to speak her mind. Just like someone else I know, Hattie teased, looking up at him. Their kiss was interrupted by Mrs. Holloway herself, clearing her throat from the doorway. While I'm pleased to see Mr. Armstrong recovering so well, she said dryly, perhaps we could maintain some propriety until after the wedding. Hattie blushed, but Mason just laughed. Speaking of the wedding, he said, keeping his arm around Hattie's waist, we've decided to stay and have it here, in Fort Worth. Mrs. Holloway's expression softened. I think that's wise. Running away would only give the gossips more to talk about. She noticed the ring on Hattie's finger and smiled. Lovely. Simple but elegant, just like you, dear. Now about that dress. The following weeks passed in a whirlwind of preparations. They decided on a small ceremony at the local church, with Judge Harmon officiating since the pastor had politely declined. Mrs. Holloway created a beautiful wedding dress of ivory silk with delicate embroidery that incorporated both American and Mexican design elements. To Hattie's surprise, several of the town's merchants contributed to the wedding. Mr. Peterson donated food for the small reception, clearly trying to make amends for his past behavior. Doc Wilson offered his garden for the gathering, and even Sheriff Taylor promised extra security to ensure there would be no disruptions. Not everyone's happy about it, Mrs. Holloway warned as she made final adjustments to Hattie's dress. But enough people have come around to make a difference. Your father saved many lives in this town, dear. People haven't forgotten, even if they let prejudice cloud their judgment for a time. On a beautiful July morning, with the Texas sun shining down, Hattie Juárez became Hattie Armstrong in a ceremony attended by a small but supportive group of Fort Worth citizens. Mason, fully recovered and handsome in a new suit, looked at her with such love that she barely noticed who else was present. Where you're from doesn't matter here, he whispered as he slipped the wedding band onto her finger. All that matters is where we're going together. They spent their wedding night in Mason's townhouse, but the following day, they loaded a wagon with supplies and headed for their land, ready to begin building their life together. The house took another 6 months to complete, with Mason hiring additional workers to speed the process. By Christmas, they were settled in their new home, the smell of fresh cut wood mingling with the aroma of Hattie's cooking to create an atmosphere of warmth and welcome. Becker and 2 of his conspirators were hanged in September for the attempted murder of Mason Armstrong. The others received prison sentences for their roles in the arson and threats. Their punishment sent a clear message that violence would not be tolerated, regardless of its motivation. Fort Worth continued to grow and change, the railroad bringing new residents from all parts of the country and beyond. Gradually, attitudes began to shift, though prejudice never disappeared entirely. Hattie established a small school on their property, teaching Spanish to the children of neighboring farms and ranches. Her reputation as an educator grew, and eventually, even some of the townspeople who had once shunned her sought her services. Mason's cattle business thrived, his contracts with Mexican buyers proving particularly lucrative thanks to Hattie's translation skills and cultural knowledge. Together, they built not just a home but a small empire, their partnership demonstrating the strength that comes from embracing differences rather than fearing them. In the spring of 1877, their first child was born, a son they named Miguel Thomas Armstrong, honoring both Hattie's heritage and Mason's late father. 2 years later, a daughter joined the family, Elena Grace Armstrong, with her father's blue eyes and her mother's dark hair. On a warm evening in 1880, 5 years after their first meeting in Peterson's store, Hattie and Mason sat on their completed porch, watching their children play in the yard while the Texas sunset painted the sky in brilliant hues. "Mama, Mira," Miguel called, holding up a small turtle he had found by the creek. At 4 years old, he switched effortlessly between English and Spanish, embodying the blending of cultures that defined his family. "Careful with him," Hattie called back in English. "Remember what Papa taught you about being gentle." Mason's arm tightened around her shoulders. "He's going to be a handful when he's older," he observed. "All that curiosity and energy." "Like his father," Hattie replied with a smile. "And stubborn like his mother," Mason added, earning a playful swat on his arm. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching as Elena toddled after her brother, determined to see the turtle despite her still unsteady legs. "Are you happy, Hattie?" Mason asked suddenly, his voice serious. "With this life we've built?" "With me?" Hattie turned to look at him, this man who had seen past prejudice to the woman beneath, who had defended her when no one else would, who had offered her not just love but respect and partnership. "Happier than I ever thought possible," she said truthfully. "When I was a girl, watching how people treated my parents, I never imagined I could have a home where I belong completely, children who are proud of all parts of their heritage, a husband who loves me for exactly who I am." Mason kissed her softly. "I told you where you're from doesn't matter here," he murmured against her lips. "All that matters is that you're home." "I am home," Hattie agreed, resting her head on his shoulder as their children's laughter filled the golden evening air. "Wherever you are, that's my home." And as the sun set on their small piece of Texas, painting the land in shades of gold and promise, Hattie Armstrong knew that she had found not just acceptance, but belonging, a place where her origins were not a burden to be overcome, but a gift to be celebrated, and a love that transcended the boundaries others had tried to impose. In the years that followed, the Armstrong family became a fixture in the community, their home a gathering place for people of all backgrounds. Mason's prediction proved correct. Fort Worth changed, slowly but surely, becoming a more diverse and tolerant city as the 19th century gave way to the 20th. Hattie never forgot the struggles of her early years, the prejudice that had threatened to crush her spirit. But those memories served not as wounds to be nursed, but as reminders of how far she had come, and of the strength she had found in adversity. When their children asked about those times, as they inevitably did, Hattie would tell them honestly about the difficulties, but always end the story the same way, with the day a courageous cowboy had stood up for a woman he didn't know, simply because it was right, and how that single act of kindness had changed both their lives forever. "Where you're from doesn't matter here," she would quote Mason's words. "What matters is who you are, what you do, and how you treat others." It was a lesson their children carried with them into the world, a legacy more valuable than any material inheritance. And in that way, the love story of Hattie and Mason Armstrong lived on, not just in their own hearts but in the generations that followed, a testament to the power of love to overcome prejudice, to build bridges where others saw only walls, and to find home in the most unexpected of places.